Chapter 6 Helping Hands The sun peeked through the window, gently filtering onto Sunset's face. It was her signal to wake up and rise with the sun, as Princess Celestia was fond of saying. Sunset wasn't terribly fond of the tradition. Just because her cutie mark was a sun certainly didn't mean she was a morning pony. But she did it every day, without complaint. Well, no complaints to anyone else in any event. She groaned as she pushed herself off the bed, haphazardly rubbing at her eyes with one hoof. Like the princess herself, Sunset was often up late into the night. Unlike the princess, she didn't have the energy of an alicorn or 2,000 years of experience to make the process easier. She had to drag herself to the mirror, but her mood improved considerably from there. Something about her reflection just seemed better than usual. Not that she could have said what. Her mane was nothing short of a mess, and there were bags under her eyes. Still, it just looked right. Good thing, too, since there wasn't much time to fix any of the imperfections. Princess Celestia would be expecting her soon, and Sunset hated making her wait. A tail light shone from her horn, and a hairbrush levitated itself to her. Practiced as she was, she barely had to focus on the thing for it to do its job. Several minutes later found Sunset turning from the mirror, with the song almost finding its way out of her smiling lips. That wouldn't do, so she allowed herself a moment to properly compose herself. Imagine if Cadence saw her so much as humming merrily. She'd probably blab about it to Princess Celestia, who would give her that cheesy smile she gave whenever she thought Sunset might actually start caring about friendship or whatever else she chose to prattle on about. Which actually didn't sound so bad. Sunset tried to think about what could possibly have her in such a good mood that she might be willing to suffer from both of Equestria's princesses praising her fo- Wait, no, Cadence would still be obnoxious. So at least there was some degree of normality in Sunset's world. With a relatively neutral expression in place, Sunset left her room. The hallway outside was wide and richly decorated. Why had she never noticed how beautiful everything was before? There were deeply colored tapestries that hung on the wall beside bright and elaborate stained glass windows. The sun shone through the windows in a full spectrum of color. Here, red and orange. Over there, yellow, green, and blue. Indigo and violet shone in between. But as she walked on, the hallway grew nearer. Sunset didn't like it. The carpet faded under her before being replaced by several rugs over hardwood flooring with red rose petals sprinkled around. The windows had lost their color, although every windowsill had a mismatched flower vase containing everything from orange marigolds to yellow sunflowers to green chrysanthemums. The tapestries were replaced with large photographs in black and white, which depicted the surrounding area in years long since past. The only color came from the flowers that covered everything. Although they had an oddly wild look to them, they seemed to be well cared for. Of course, that was to be expected in Canterlot Castle. Flowers even grew out of the hallway itself, with blue hydrangeas dotting the walls and indigo lupines growing from cracks in the ground. Sunset kept a brisk pace. Princess Celestia was waiting for her after all. It wasn't long before she came to the doors. They stretched out as far as she could see, although she knew there was an end. Each door led to a child's room. Through a red door a girl was crying. Through an orange one she could hear yelling. Sunset hated the other children. They all wanted to play with her. No one understood her here. The windows were small and didn't open, and the walls were decorated with crude paintings from the children, primary and secondary colors with the palette used in everything, yellow, green, and blue abounding wherever she looked. She came next to the dining room. There were several people already gathered. They had left a spot for her, so she climbed into it. The chair felt awkward, and she remembered that it wasn't made for some pony like her, rather somebody like the people around her. She would make the most of it. It was important to eat breakfast. They would be upset with her if she didn't. Everything was made for children. Her plate was bright red and her cup orange. Both were plastic so as not to be broken. Off to the side were her yellow fork and green spoon, also plastic. There was no knife. Children didn't use those. First she tried to use her magic to lift her utensils, but it didn't work. That's right, magic never worked here. She would have to wait until she was with Princess Celestia in the other parts of the castle for that. Meanwhile, people were staring at her. She reached for a fork, but it was not made for hooves. Rose Petal was looking at her disapprovingly. Sunset didn't want to let her down, so she decided to make an excuse for herself. "I'm not really hungry today," she said. "I think I'll skip breakfast. Do you know where Princess Celestia is?" Her voice seemed to alarm the other children. You're always such a freak, Sugar Breeze yelled at her. Dewdrop was crying again. She was always crying. I'm not a freak, Sunset claimed. Her words had no effect. Rose Petal stood up and walked over to her. She would help. She always said Sunset could count on her to help. Before she even realized what was going on, Rose Petal had already pulled off Sunset's shirt. Although ponies often went without clothes, Sunset felt strange without it. She tried to back away, but tripped. She didn't remember how many legs to walk with. Rose Petal roughly took hold of her shorts and pulled them off as well. Sunset pushed the elderly caretaker away, not caring what happened as she fell to the ground. Remembering how to properly move her legs, Sunset ran. She made it through the front door and found she was surrounded by mirrors. On the left she saw herself, a unicorn of red, orange, and yellow. On the right she saw some pony else, an alicorn wearing her colors. That wasn't her, but it could be, so she ran to it. Her reflection wore a sinister grin, but she didn't care. It was all she ever wanted. She would be an alicorn, a princess. She would be Princess Celestia's favorite again. The mirrors shattered, the pieces piercing her skin. In the shards on the ground she saw her reflection. It was warped beyond recognition, and it was exactly what she was. She was a freak, a nightmare creature, a thing. Come with me, a voice said. Sunset saw Violet Dusk beside her, passive as always. Her command was simple, so Sunset followed it. She no longer worried that she wasn't wearing clothes. Horses never wore clothes. Where are we going? Sunset asked, but Violet ignored her. Sunset went along with her, but never with the intent of doing what Violet wanted her to. It was simply the path of least resistance. Violet led her back to her car, where Sunset barely fit. As they drove, she noticed her blood. It flowed from the many cuts the glass had given her, soaking red into her orange fur. They arrived at the one place Sunset never wanted to see again, a farm that felt large enough to be a prison. Violet let her out, and Sunset ran. She would not be there. She ran, but she was found. Crystal Clear stood in her way, a patronizing smile on his face. She wouldn't stop, not for him. She reared back and brought her forelegs down onto him. She didn't know what would happen to him, but that wasn't her concern. She ran back along the road she came from, and found herself face to face with the little girl. She stopped suddenly, not wanting to accidentally run into Applejack. She held out her hand, and Sunset approached her slowly. Stay by her side, she will help you. Run away from her, you'll both be better off. Everything will be okay, Applejack said. How do you know? Sunset asked. I just do. Trust me, it's the honest truth. Sunset wanted to, but she couldn't. She ran past Applejack, putting the silly girl behind her. She didn't know how long she ran for, but it didn't matter. All paths led back to one place. She didn't need to try more than one, she just knew. She was back at the barn, as she would be from any other route she took. But anything was better than the barn and the creature inside it, the creature like her. She turned to leave, but there was nothing behind her. The nothingness approached her, and she turned from it. It forced her up against the barn. She heard a voice inside, rough, male. Go away, it said. Your kind is not supposed to be here. But the nothingness drew ever closer, and Sunset wouldn't go in it. Without thinking, she kicked in the door to the barn. It wouldn't follow her into the barn. Chestnut was waiting, as she knew he would be. He snarled at her. I told you to leave, he said. This is not a place for humans. I'm not a human, Emma. Sunset pleaded for him to understand, for something to understand. He approached her snarling, backing her into the wall. He had heavy iron chains keeping him from reaching her, the same as she had around her own neck. This was the place for her, the place she belonged. Although it made the chains dig into her neck, Sunset turned away. The burn was dull and void of color, except for one. Red spider lilies raised up around her, her favorite. They were the flowers of death and of hell. She bent down to reach one, but it was just out of her grasp. She strained her neck as far as she could, longing for the poisonous bulb. Everything would be okay if she could eat just one. Even as she woke up, Sunset hid under her blanket. She didn't want to see herself in the mirror. Didn't even want to so much as check her own body to see what species she was. As long as she didn't know, there was a chance she was still human. But whether she wanted to or not, she could feel herself drifting out of consciousness. If she remained in the dark, she'd sleep again, and she'd dream again. There was no choice. Sunset had to get up. But first, she would make sure of something. Without opening her eyes, she slowly lifted her hand and pressed it to her face. She felt 5 little points press into her cheek, proving that it was indeed a hand, not a hoof. She pulled the cover off and looked into the mirror. She saw a little girl with red and yellow hair that was all tangled up from tossing and turning in her sleep. Still, her heart wouldn't stop pounding. She couldn't forget everything that had just happened, even if it was a dream. A knock on the door made her retreat back under her blanket. "Sunset, it's time for breakfast," Rose Petal called through the door. Sunset didn't answer. She didn't want to see Rose Petal, not after what she dreamt about. Moments passed without any other interruptions, meaning that Rose probably had already moved on to the other rooms. It was only a minor relief, since Sunset knew she would be back soon. Rose could come back, but she would not get in. Rising from her bed, Sunset moved quickly. She cleared off her bedside table and pushed it against the door. She would have liked to have moved the bookshelf, or, even better, the heavy dresser that was next to the door, but even the comparatively small bedside table proved to be a challenge for her small body. She piled everything she could on top of it, even if it only amounted to a few books. Hopefully it would be heavy enough to keep Rose and everyone else out. She got it in place not a moment too soon. There was another knock on the door. "Sunset? What was that noise?" Sunset ran back towards the bed, opting to hide under it instead of on top. The doorknob turned, and the door was pushed open slightly before being stopped by the table. The only thing that managed to work its way into the room was a light from the hallway. "Sunset, what's going on in there? Are you okay?" Rose sounded concerned. It was a tone Sunset couldn't trust. When had she ever done anything to earn that concern? She had caused problems for Rose the entire time she'd been at New Horizons. There was no way she could be genuinely concerned about Sunset's well-being now. It was a trap. She was faking it to lure Sunset out. "Sunset, please, answer me." The door pushed against the bedside table, but it didn't move. "I just want to help you, please. Just come to the door." Lies. Tricks and treachery. Sunset wouldn't fall for them. The noise stopped eventually. Footsteps led away from the room, but it hardly made Sunset feel safer. She reached a hand out from under the bed in order to grab her blanket and pillows. She covered her body with the blanket and placed the pillows in front of her, leaving just a crack between the top of the pillows and the bottom of the bed frame which she could see out of. The minutes passed slowly. Whether it was because of the hard floor or because she was terrified, Sunset was now much further from sleep. That was good. They could take her much more easily if she were asleep. She wouldn't let that happen, no matter what. Sunset had no idea how long she lay under the bed, watching the door. It felt like hours at the least, although she knew that was probably not the case. In any event, it was all too soon that another knock came, and a different voice called through it. "Sunset, it's crystal clear. Will you open the door?" What was he doing here? After a moment's silence, he tried the door. Thankfully, the table still held it in place. "You don't want to talk to me through the door, do you?" he asked as if she wanted to talk to him at all. The door closed and she heard muffled voices from the other side, followed by silence. She wanted to believe that meant they had given up, but she knew better. She maintained her silent vigil on the door. Enough time passed that she really did believe she might have won out, until she heard another sound coming from the wall to her right. Her head jerked to look, but she couldn't see anything. Still, she knew what that sound was. Someone was opening her window. She could tell from the sound that it was already opened, at least in part, leaving her no time to lock it. Instead, she pushed her way farther under the bed, hiding in a small corner underneath her blanket. She heard footsteps. "Sunset?" Crystal Clear called out. His voice was gentle, the same trap that Rose Petal had tried. "Come on out. We need to talk." The closet door opened, then closed a moment later. The footsteps came closer, stopping just short of the bed. Sunset squeezed her eyes shut as tight as possible, willing him away. "There you are." His voice was much too close. If she had looked, she knew she'd see him on the ground looking right at her. "Why are you under the bed, Sunset?" Sunset wouldn't move. He hadn't seen her, and she wouldn't acknowledge him. "Miss Rose is worried about you. She told me that you haven't said a word all day." Sunset continued, not speaking. "She said that you've been distant since we went to Sweet Apple Acres." The name caused her to wince. If she could, Sunset would never even think of that place again. "Please, Sunset, I want to help you, but you need to talk to me." Sunset pulled the blanket down just below her eyes. "You're lying." Crystal Clear was flat on his stomach, with his head barely underneath the bed. Although he probably could have reached her if he tried, he wouldn't do anything to try to force her out. Now, why would you think that? Because, why did she think that? Everything blurred together, all her thoughts and emotions. You don't even understand what's going on. I'm sorry I don't have all the answers for you, Sunset, but I do want to help you. He reached an arm under the bed, but didn't attempt to grab her. It would be a lot easier to understand what's going on with you if you talked to me about it, and it would be a lot easier to talk if you come out from under the bed. Sunset stared at his open hand for a moment, then ignored it as she crawled out from under the bed on her own. Crystal Clear moved out of her way, then took a seat on her bed once she was out. He patted the spot next to him for her to sit down as well. She did sit on the bed, but picked a spot further away from him. Now then, want to tell me what's going on today? Crystal asked. Sunset folded her arms and scowled. You wouldn't understand. I don't know, I can be pretty understanding. Did you have a nightmare? For a second, Sunset turned to him with a bewildered look, but she soon realized that it must have been fairly obvious. It was early in the morning, after all. Yes. Nightmares can be scary, he said in his most patronizing tone, but it wasn't real. You know nothing from your dreams can hurt you, right? It almost seemed like he forgot whom he was talking to. I know that, Sunset answered sharply. I'm not an idiot. I know you're not. I'm sorry. Sunset doubted that. Did you know dreams have hidden meanings? Sunset didn't have the patience to go through all the motions with him. Yes, and you probably figured that I do. You're just trying to ease your way into asking me what I dreamt about while making me feel like I was the one who wanted to open up about it in the first place. When they first met, Crystal Clear would have been caught off guard by a comment like that, but it had been over a month with weekly sessions, and he had since grown accustomed to her. Well, you're half right. I did want to ease into the question, but I wasn't going to try to manipulate you into anything. That was a lie. He was just trying to cut his losses. So then, do you want to tell me what you dreamed about? No. Okay. He smiled, which caught Sunset off guard. He looked at the no longer bedside table and noticed the books on top of it. Have you been enjoying these books more? Sunset looked at the book. There was a book about basic electronics, which was written for kids, but Sunset didn't mind so much as it was a subject she knew nothing about. The other book was finally something suitable for her age. Of course, Sunset usually wasn't interested in reading books for teenagers, but it was a hell of a lot better than the juvenile stuff she had to read to get to it. They're good, Sunset said, unable to form a better answer. Aren't you going to try to get me to tell you about the dream? Crystal's smile widened. I think it would be helpful for you to talk about it, and I want you to know you can tell me anything at all. But no, I'm not going to force you. It's your decision whether you want to tell me or not. Well, I don't, Sunset said definitively, frowning as she turned away. Meanwhile, thoughts of the dreams lingered, eating away at her. So, have you gotten to the part where I dreamed I was a horse? To his credit, Crystal Clear only needed a moment to compose himself before proceeding professionally. I see. And what happened while you were a horse? I was... Sunset shook her head. She wanted to say it so she would understand how ridiculous it sounded. Maybe that would get her to stop dwelling on it, but she hated admitting something bothered her. Like he doesn't already know. He saw me run away crying a few days ago. I can see how that might have been disconcerting, he prompted gently. It wasn't, at first. But then, at first, I thought I was a pony. I only realized I was a horse afterwards. You were okay with being a pony then? Sunset looked down at her hand. She balled her fingers into a fist and tried to imagine it was a hoof again. Yes. What happened when you realized you were a horse? I was taken away to Sweet Apple Acres. They chained me up in the barn with the other horse. Is that when you woke up? Sunset opened her mouth to agree, then stopped. No, that wasn't quite it, was it? There were flowers there, Lycoris radiata, which are poisonous. I was trying to eat them, but I woke up first. Crystal Clear nodded and put his hands together on his lap. Dream interpretation isn't an exact science. Most things have a few different things they can mean, so we'll have to work together to figure out what your dream means to you. Horses, for example, can be a sign of strength, or they can represent arrogance. Sunset shook her head. I know what it meant. Oh, and what's that? Sunset didn't answer. I can't help you if you don't. You wouldn't get it. Nothing is what it's supposed to be. Sunset jumped to her feet and gestured toward the mirror. This is wrong. I'm wrong. You can't. Although Sunset's temper was heating up, Crystal Clear seemed remarkably cool. Talk to me, Sunset. I want to understand, but I can't help you unless you help me. I don't need any help. Oh, Sunset, my gifted student. Everyone needs help sometimes. I know I certainly do. The only thing any pony wants from me is a free ride to the top. I don't need them. Yes, there are some ponies who would manipulate you for their own gain. But you're a smart mare, and I think you could tell the difference between some pony like that and some pony who just wants to be friendly if you tried. Ask yourself if some pony really seems trustworthy, and I think you'll find most of them are. And when you find some pony you can trust, you'll be amazed at how much better you feel when you open up to them. Equestria was fading from Sunset's memory much faster than it should have. She suspected it had something to do with her smaller, child-sized brain. There was a certain shop she liked to take breaks from studying in. She could no longer remember what it smelled like. There were ponies that she knew, acquaintances even if they were never friends. She remembered them less and less. She had to struggle to remember the taste of hay and flowers, foods that humans didn't eat. But there were memories that would never fade. There was the feeling of being left alone while her aristocratic parents were too busy for their daughter. The thrill of magic and using it to get the recognition every pony told her she deserved. Cadence's ascension putting all of her own accomplishments to shame. And then there was her, the day that she invited Sunset to be her own personal student, which even caused her parents to look proud. The first winter when she wore that hideously ugly scarf every day, the one Sunset had foolishly tried to make for her, thinking it would be easy. Times that she took Sunset out of class for private lessons, which amounted to nothing more than secret trips to the ice cream parlor. And then years later when she invited Sunset to leave her parents' house and live in the castle with her, as if Sunset was part of her family. There was Celestia. If there was nothing else in her life worth remembering, there was Celestia, her princess, her idol, her mentor. Sunset had shunned everything she taught that wasn't magical, and where had it gotten her? She looked at Crystal Clear. Sunset was a smart girl, and who knew? Maybe she'd be amazed at how much better she felt. Well, the thing is, I'm not actually. Crystal Clear just waited patiently. As she paused, he nodded to encourage her. Sunset looked away as she returned to her seat. She couldn't look at him while she explained, I'm not exactly from around here. He took a moment to answer, sounding more uncertain once he did. What do you mean? I lied. I didn't want to tell anyone anything about me because you'll never believe it. Still so much doubt, Crystal said. He leaned in closer. Sunset, does this have something to do with ponies? Sunset spun around to face him. His smile was less encouraging, more knowing. What do you know about ponies? Crystal shrugged and faced forward, adopting a matter-of-fact tone. I'm a psychologist, not a biologist, so not all that much. But I did look into them since they came up with you, and it turns out that ponies are just small horses. He turned back to her, the knowing smile returning. Somehow he managed to sound like he was genuinely interested in what she had to say, while still giving the impression that he already knew everything. I know there's more going on than you've been saying, so why don't you tell me what you know about ponies? I... I'm a pony. It was all Sunset could manage to say. Crystal seemed to consider it for a moment, while never seeming to doubt her for a second. You don't look like a pony, he said casually. It wasn't an accusation that she was lying, just a simple observation. I know, Sunset said, glancing at her reflection. The mirror turned me into a human when it brought me to Earth. We don't have humans in Equestria. Well, that must have been a very shocking experience. Sunset couldn't believe it. There wasn't a trace of doubt in his voice at all. She scooted over, closing the distance between them as she began to talk more excitedly. It was horrifying. I panicked and wound up letting myself get taken away from the portal. Where was the portal? I don't know. It was where the police found me. I tried finding it again, but I couldn't. The night you snuck out? Sunset frowned. He didn't say it accusingly, but she still felt guilty admitting it. Yeah, I was trying to find my way back. I just want to go home. I might be able to find out where they found you. Really? Sunset's excitement faded as soon as it had come. Oh, but it's closed now. What do you mean? The portal won't work? No, it's only open for 3 days, once every 30 moons. I suppose that must be why you've been so frustrated. Sunset nodded enthusiastically. That's just the start. I am 17, but when the mirror changed my body, it also made me younger. Crystal Clear smiled a bit. Pieces fall into place. Sunset was about to launch into an explanation of how she was a unicorn, so she also lost her magic in the transition, but stopped short. You, you really believe me? Crystal Clear stopped to consider that for a moment. It's a lot to take in. Maybe things like this happen in magical worlds like Equestria, but this is unheard of on Earth. Sunset bowed her head. But on the other hand, I'm not the type to just throw out possibilities. A lot of things could be explained by this, so I'm willing to look at it with an open mind. We'll have to see what happens from here. Okay, Sunset nodded. That seems reasonable. Really, it was better than anything she would have dared to expect. At his prompting, she talked more about life in Equestria. She could hardly believe how good it felt to finally be open about it. It seemed Celestia knew what she was talking about after all.